Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Security Strategist. My name is Steffen. I am the Vice President of Research for EMA, an analyst firm that examines how companies manage their IT infrastructure from the data center to the user environment and into the cloud. And I am the information security nerd in charge there. Today, I am excited to welcome Brady Harrison, Director of Customer Analytics Solution Delivery at Kount, to discuss today how we're going to maximize value through optimal security strategies. Brady, why don't you give us a quick introduction, tell us a little bit about Kount, and then we'll kind of take it from there.
Hi, Chris. Thanks. Again, Brady Harrison, Director of Customer Analytics Solution Delivery here at Kount. I work on customer performance and fraud analytics for our customers, right? Who are those customers, right? We're an identity proofing fraud analytics company. Been around since 2007, acquired by Equifax in 2021, and now we're part of the Equifax family as a Kount and Equifax company. We work on identity, compliance, payments fraud, account protection, kind of covers the gamut. Most excited today, though, to talk about payments fraud, where I've spent 8 years of my career working on chargebacks and manual reviews. And, how do we optimize your payment strategy vis-a-vis some of your other goals? Market expansion, right? EBITDA expansion, that kind of level.
Yeah, that's awesome. I actually was a principal architect for a credit reporting company way back in my career. So been working with our friends at Equifax for a long, long time and love the stuff that you guys do. I really kind of wanted to get started today and talk a little bit about some of the different strategies out there based on geolocation. Specifically, I know that you guys cover everybody in the globe, and that's fantastic. But talk to me a little bit about what the differences are between a security strategy in the EU for an EU-based company and one that's based in the US.
Yeah, traditionally, it's been in the EU, we have pretty strong customer authentication, or that kind of SCA bucket. And so historically, that's meant some kind of 3DS or liability shifting option, right? Independent of the level of friction, right? European consumers generally are pretty tolerant of this friction, intolerant of, fraud happening at all. Where in some of the kind of downsides of these kind of high friction options are, in their mind, worth it for not having to deal with the fraud approach. So overall, it's a no fraud possible posture, meaning, hey, we're okay if we lose some sales, but that means we have no loss, meaning we have liability shift on essentially every transaction, and we're pretty high friction from an overall customer experience. So that's traditionally been the European model, even pre where these were required, right? Where it's like, hey, we'll just engage in these services that make fraud go away, maybe at the cost of sales. Where the US has taken a fairly different approach, where it's about revenue maximization and how can I manage this kind of fraud bucket. Historically, that's been via rules and policies, right? That was kind of the early days. Right around the 2010s, that transitioned into more of a machine learning powered fraud prevention strategy or a security strategy that then uses some human intervention on the margins to prevent that. Over the last probably 5 or 6 years, we've seen the US move to almost completely a machine learning option. It says, hey, we can manage down fraud to an appropriate level, but we can manage up our approvals and manage down our declines also to an appropriate levels. And so in their mind, we'll take some of the calories of fraud, but we get all the flavor of really, really high approval rates, really low cart abandonment overall. So what should be emerging is we're seeing Europe is like, hey, we're okay with a no fraud model, where in the US, the kind of security posture is we're okay with a no loss sales model, meaning we will take some losses on the fraud or otherwise, so we can pick up that marginal edge customer from a revenue perspective. And if we appropriately manage that posture, we'll say, hey, we have a 20% profit margin. And so as long as an individual order, and we're staying within our vein, has a less than 10% fraud rate, we're still making money on those on balance, barring things getting out of whack. So that was generally, one is kind of fraud a minimizing strategy, and the other one, in my view, appears to be a revenue or profit maximizing strategy, even if you do have some incremental loss. So long story long, a balance.
Yeah, and somewhere in there is the balance, right? Just like you just said. I mean, you want to take and have somewhere in there a balance between the two, between the extremely aggressive fraud prevention and the we want the sales at all costs. And I'm obviously maximizing both of those there, but somewhere in the middle there is the ideal strategy. Talk to me a little bit more about what the main issues are with a traditional strategy in today's market. I mean, you kind of have examples of both there. What are some of the major issues that you're seeing?
So on the EU side, we're seeing a lot of the risk around cart abandonment, bad customer experience, where 3D Secure is awesome from a fraud liability shift perspective, but there are instances where folks, either can't get passively authenticated, or if they are kind of active friction, need to get authenticated, they can't actually complete the authentication, right? Can't receive the text message, email not working, right? Something in that vein where they can't actually do the authentication. So you have some cart abandonment. So that's the real downside, is you start to lose some options or customers right on that 1 or 2%, 5% edge, right? We hear stories from some folks that we work with that 15% cart abandonment on a challenge is pretty normal, right? Some industry stats around 11, right? So we're saying north of 10, double digit abandonment. And so if you step up 100% of your transactions, right? You're just doing a classic, will 3D Secure everything strategy. You're probably going to lose conservatively 5 to 10% of your sales from cart abandonment, right? People who get authenticated and can't actually complete the authentication. This is really why the US has been kind of on the opposite side of the coin, where, right, some passive authentication strategies are getting better, but, you tell a CFO that, in order to eliminate my 20 basis points of fraud problem, I need to lose 1,000 basis points of fraud or of good sales. That is not going to work, right? That would be an anathema to someone who's running the numbers. And so that's the downside on the other end, is that it's taken some management. And then there's always the marginal transaction of like, okay, well, this does have like a 22% fraud rate below our margin, right? Looks pretty obvious. That still means 80% of those customers are good. And is there a way to extract the value out of there? And so to distill it, the European approach is probably leaves too many sales on the table, where the US approach is probably a little overindulgent in fraud. And or historically, some folks have moved to manual reviews to kind of deal with that marginal transaction, so operational costs that you need to deal with, as well as customer fulfillment. So it's, hey, could we use that middle path, right? Let's set, using machine learning, let's find our 5% riskiest transactions where 80% of the loss comes in anyway. Let's just 3D Secure those. And then, we'll take 10% on 5% versus 10% on 100. That's, I think, where the meeting in the middle is potentially happening, based on the questions that I'm getting from kind of both sides of the pond, right? From the US side, how do we use this more? And the European side, how do we take advantage of some of these TRA or transaction risk assessment exemptions to not do a secure authentication for every individual purchase?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. When you start taking and talking about, the idea that you're potentially leaving double-digit percentage of your revenue on the table, I can't think of an executive team anywhere that's going to be okay with that, at least from a US perspective, right? And so any way that you can improve upon the fraud that is being committed is going to be interesting, but then you don't want to lose that amount in the sales as part of the sales cycle. So I totally get that perspective. And the kicker is from your perspective, Brady, what can companies do to optimize their security investments to achieve that growth that they're looking for while continuing to address some of the fraud concerns?
Yeah, a big part of that optimization is, right, just because you have a hammer doesn't mean everything's a nail.
Absolutely.
Right? 3D Secure is awesome, but do I really need to use it on Brady's 15th order with us? He orders, right, my wife and I really like coffee And so we get online ordering coffee all the time, probably once or twice a week. And we have one place that we really like to go. And so can you imagine if we got a 3D secure verification every single time we wanted to order coffee? That would break some of the convenience of doing it. One. And two, from a cost perspective, right? Does that really make sense for that coffee company to spend what is marginal cost, but things add up, right? People are talking about changing their straws to save half a penny per straw. And so can we eliminate some of that 3D secure cost where it doesn't make sense, right? Brady's a good customer. He's been with us a long time, right? We don't need to 3D secure that.
Yeah, especially from a trusted customer, right? I mean, Brady's a good guy, right? We know that Brady is a good guy. Brady has ordered from us a gazillion times. We like Brady. Brady, we know well. And ironically, in a not e-commerce perspective, in a coffee shop perspective, to continue your example, you would know the barista, you would know the coffee person, you would know all that. They would probably know you by name at this point. And the idea of establishing a trust relationship with that coffee shop, that company, it would be almost automatic because, again, you would be what would be considered to be a regular. And so that person would even know your order and be able to, trust you that they can do whatever they need to do. There would never be a whole lot of question about payment.
Exactly. The one risk here, though, is if you just go, hey, we'll just have some expert system to decide where our risk is. Hey, Brady's an old customer. The coffee he's buying is expensive, right? Coffee's going up there, but not super expensive, not way outside of our vein. So we're never going to 3D secure Brady. I was like, well, maybe that doesn't make sense all the time, right? And that's where a machine learning model can come in and kind of do some of that robust analysis of, hey, we've seen a lot of transactions from him. Here's the regular risk profile for customers like this, tend to be pretty low, but it's not automatic, right? Maybe you're ordering way outside your normal time frame or from an odd location, or there are weird links between the device that's being used and other devices, right? These are hypothetical scenarios, but something about Brady's risk profile has changed.
It could be something as simple as it's the holidays and you are placing a huge order because you're buying coffee for your best friend, Chris, because it is Christmas time.
Exactly.
And he loves his good coffee. So I expect my package in the mail.
And that might be a 3D secure example of like, hey, I really like Chris. I'm going to buy him $500 worth of coffee.
Yes.
That's a little outside the vein. So maybe we do 3D secure that transaction or that purchase because it's a sliding scale, a dynamic friction based on machine learning versus just like pure expert system rules analysis, right? Rules can be helpful on those edge cases, but on balance, we're like, hey, we're not going to 3D secure Brady 99% of the time, but the 1% of the time that he does something way outside the vein of risk, then we'll insulate ourselves from that risk using 3D secure. That's where things I think start to get interesting because you can say, hey, we're going to a new market. We want to take advantage of our customer acquisition strategy there. So let's only 3D secure the 10% of risk versus 5, right? Because maybe it's a higher risk market than you've traditionally been, but you don't want to 3D secure everything. And that's where you can have this machine learning sliding scale based on whatever your business goals are without having to be kind of wizard behind the curtain, like turning dials and knobs constantly, where you still get, hey, we can get all of the flavor of, a liability shift solution with none of the calories where we're rejecting 5 to 10% of our step ups from cart abandonment or inappropriate failure, whatever. That's where I think the happy middle path starts to get interesting for most businesses, where let's take a little bit of the European approach mixed with the US profit kind of revenue maximizing approach together and say, hey, where does this tool make the most sense versus just applying it, broadly across the board?
Yeah, I agree. One, I hope that your process is approved because I would really like that $500 of coffee coming my way. That would make my day. Second of all, you already talked about it a little bit and it makes perfect sense, right? How does moving away from the traditional methods that we're using towards more machine learning based strategies benefit the business in the long run? We kind of discussed it a little bit, but I really do want to put a pin in it because I think that is really kind of the purpose and the takeaway from this conversation. What are some of the key advantages for machine learning and security? How do we take and use it to improve decision making and threat mitigation compared to some of the older approaches. I really kind of want to end with that conversation.
Yeah, I think the key here is human beings are really, really good at spotting risk in hindsight, right? Designing some bucket. The downside of a lot of these strategies is they can be fairly brittle, right? Where, hey, normally our bad transactions or bad events look like this or look like that. All it takes, is one slight change, right? I work with a lot of folks and they're like, well, all of our fraud is happening with one specific item or one specific kind of electronics. Like maybe it's an iPhone, it was PlayStation 5 for a little while. As a fraud strategy person, right, it's really easy to be like, well, if someone buys a PS5, we're going to 3D secure that transaction, which will work great for eliminating fraud against PlayStation 5s. The downside is fraudsters are probably not that interested in the PlayStation 5 because they want to play, Grand Theft Auto 6, right? They are interested in it because they want to resell that PlayStation 5 for value. And so they may be like, well, the Xbox One, maybe not as high ticket, but I can still steal it. And so that means your strategy becomes fairly brittle because it just needs the bad actor to change what they're buying. In a more modern approach using machine learning, we would say, hey, this behavior in and of itself is risky, and independently of like the exact line item that they buy or the email domain that they use, this looks like risky behavior. So rather than like, well, we'll step up PlayStation 5s all the time, and then you lose a bunch of Xbox Ones or iPhones, whatever, fraudsters are like water. They kind of move wherever you are not. Where if you use machine learning, you're really responding to those in real time. And looking at, small gradations of risk will appear in a machine learning model that may not be evident to a human being, right? I can review like 10 to 20 transactions in an hour, right? A machine learning model can review millions of transactions an hour, right? They talk about transactions per second. And so you just get a more holistic view, and it actually responds in real time versus a traditional strategy where, we're setting different lines in the sand and trying to predict. That's pretty challenging for an individual user versus this machine learning model built by folks generally with PhDs who are constantly iterating and looking to improve on that model, right? One of those is a lot easier from an operational standpoint. Hey, I'll just lean on them to decide how risky this transaction is. And then they'll lean on me to decide, what's my business strategy here? Do I want to step up 1% of events, 2% of events, 3% of events, 4%? And working with them like, hey, where's your efficient frontier from a value perspective? Because ultimately your goal is not to have zero fraud, right? I don't transparently think that should be the goal. There will always be fraud.
Yeah, that's not realistic.
Yeah. And so then it's like, how do we maximize revenue? And at that point, it's like, well, we want to minimize the customers that we step up and only step up the customers that we need to. And then on balance, the customers that we don't need to will be highly profitable, great experiences for them. And so they'll continue to come back. And that's where I think the modern machine learning says, hey, let's set our security strategy based on machine learning. And then it's not set and forget, but it's a little easier to be like, hey, we're running a little hot right now against our goals. Let's turn down. Or, hey, we're not running we're doing pretty well. We're kind of in a customer acquisition mode. We're willing to take, 3 or 4 extra basis points of fraud to get that additional customer conversion in this new strategy, right? Maybe it's a new brand, new geo, right? New kind of ordering, right? Maybe a new method, right? Buy online, pick up in store was a big one during the pandemic. A lot of people kind of turned on that workflow, and they were really interested in making sure people could use it. That's where hey, our normal strategy is 5%, but in this new geo, we really want to drive traffic, so we're only going to look at the worst 2%. Or hey, this is a really high risk geo that we want to go to. Maybe we move to 10% because our margin is smaller in that geo because we have a profit share, right? Or we have some concern that we need to deal with. That's where I think you get a lot of the benefits of a layered dynamic approach that the US tends to take with some of the liability shifting that Europe tends to have. Those are coming together, right? Especially as passive authentication gets better, that step up process is going to get even easier. So you may actually expand that bucket from 5 to 10%. because you know that, hey, 20% of these folks are going to get passively authenticated anyway. And we get that liability shift without actually doing a real, step up that's visible to the consumer. That I think is where 24 and 25 will be moving to, is more and more people will kind of experience a step up, good and bad, meaning they get a step up that fails. Right? I received one last year. I was buying a plane ticket at my work computer, right, using a different email than I normally use. I was buying a friend's trip, and I got a 3D secure step up from an old card that I don't use very much. It had an old home phone number listed as the step up authentication method, right? Can't get a text message to an old phone. And that card failed, right? That I failed that 3D secure transaction. Chris, you know what I did? I just pulled out another branded card and used that card, no authentication, probably looking at more of a dynamic option, and checked out. And that card has now stayed at the bottom of the pile. And that brand where I made that purchase actually went down to the bottom of the pile as well.
You got it. No, I get it, right? At the end of the day, for customers out there, for companies out there, this is just yet another way of talking about risk and evaluating your risk and making intelligent, thoughtful determinations on how much fraud you're going to allow compared to how much in sales you need to generate. But taking and looking at it from a 100,000-foot view, you're talking about making a business decision, a risk-based decision based on available data. And it doesn't have to be all one or the other. You're actually taking in, can throttle things to make that determination. And ideally, that's how businesses should work on their security, no matter how you're looking at it. It should be, regardless of whatever path you decide going down, when you make an intelligent, risk-based, informed decision, at least then you understand what you're getting yourself into and how your company is going to be impacted by that decision. At the end of the day, that's what we want. We want informed users. We want informed companies making intelligent, risk-based decisions.
100%. And it's not like it's an anathema to go the other direction, right? We see folks who are like, the best 90% of customer, really like 99, have like no fraud. And so we're seeing like low single-digit fraud rates for direct authorization transactions. And then a lot of the liability is happening on the other side. And so you get, right, low single-digit fraud rates with still having like high 90s approvals, where if fraud has essentially been eliminated, where you don't have these kind of fall off problems of one solution or the other, right? If they went the total Euro solution, right, you maybe get a 90% approval, fraud is virtually eliminated. On the US side, you get high 90s approvals, but you're still dealing and thinking about fraud at a regular clip. And we've seen an example of ours in the UK where someone is really kind of down that fine line where they're getting a lot of transactions just go directly to authorization without this kind of any friction, any step up, any security cost. And the rest get stepped up and, we have some fall offs, have some failures, but that number remains pretty small. And so then it's just continual optimization. So it's not like it's a paradigm shift of, you're at either 20 basis points of fraud or 0 for step up or not, right? Most of your customers are good and you should treat them as such from a security perspective, right? Until they're not. And that's where the machine learning bit comes in to kind of set that bucket. Is you are a good customer until you prove otherwise. And then we're continuing to learn. Did we step up Chris last time and he successfully passed? We should probably take that into account when we are looking at Chris or Brady again. And we can do that across a network of events. That's really where machine learning gets interesting, as you kind of have data from outside your own four walls. And that's the real supercharging of this machine learning bucket. As you can develop a model internally, but until you get feedback from outside your own walls, that's where the real paradigm shift actually does occur.
Yep. No, that sounds fantastic. And, again, we're always talking about interesting machine learning AI use cases. And this is yet another one that's going to really start revolutionizing how we do things. But wanted to thank you, Brady. A great conversation today. Very, very technical, but very, very to the point and really resonates well with me, at least, right? Very great examples. Really appreciate you coming on to the Security Strategist. Thanks, everybody, to listening. I hope that you took a lot away from today's podcast. For more information about what we talked about, head on over to Kount.com, Kount.com, We'll be back next week with another episode in our series. Until then, make certain that you subscribe to this podcast on all of our major platforms and follow the conversation on our social media, EM360 Tech on X and LinkedIn. And for more daily content, head over to em360tech.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.